Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Monsieur l'ambassadeur, bonsoir. Thank you for coming for the purchase Writers, etc. Writers, etc. is cooperation between the French Embassy and Institut Français with the book office of the French Embassy and my dear colleague Julie. And today is the purchase 3-0. So it's a long story between the the Indian writers community, the French writers community, and Ambassade de France and Alliance Française. And Julie told me, because I was not here at this moment, that when we had some ceremony of the reopening of the Alliance Française library, there was some very interesting Indian writers called Rana Dasgupta who made a talk. And from this first talk, they created the concept, the idea of the writers, etc. So your first talk, this talk there was the writers, etc. number 0. So now you are invited for the writers, etc. number 30. Thank you very much. And Chiki, you came last time with interviewing Chobade, having a conversation with Chobade. It was, I think, 1.5 years ago, something like that. So thank you for coming. And I must thank Julie also because she created a real community of Indian writers in the Indian writers, etc. fans or things like that. And we can meet people in some places and say, oh, I want to do the next writers, etc. because my friend did it, and always remembering of the writers, etc. they did. So there is a real writers, etc. atmosphere. And thank you, Judith, for having built this strong connection between the Indian writers, the Ambassade de France and the Alliance Française. Really. And I want just to thank her for that, because it's 3-0, this kind of celebration. Thank you, Judith. And she have just put together for the book office of the French Embassy. So, thank you, Rana. Thank you, Chiki. And now the floor is yours, all yours. Thank you.
Ladies, is there an on? Yeah,
oh, it's here. Okay. Got it?
Hello?
Yeah, come here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here for all kinds of reasons. Rana is a writer I both admire and he's also a friend. So it's a double treat. And I'm also loving that I'm on stage with a glass of wine. This has never happened to me. So I've always, when I began my publishing life, I remember going to the event that Martin Amis and Christopher Hitchens were at Have Festival. And they walked on stage with cans of beer. And I thought this was the most glamorous thing I'd ever seen. I thought they were like Mick Jagger. And here I am with a glass of wine. So it's my dreams come true. We're going to talk about Rana the writer across his 3 books. I think most of you probably have read Capital, his most recent novel, and all the reviews and interviews. So we'll keep that bit short and then talk about his writing career at length. But I want to start with Capital because it's in everyone's mind, it's in my mind. It's the last book of Rana's that I read. And I want to start with asking you, Rana, a question that I had as I finished the book, which is, do you like Delhi?
Thank you. I just want to say before I answer that question, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here. It seems symbolic for me too. Can you hear me? I can't hear myself. It was the 22nd of October 2010 that we did this first event, which led to this thing. And that evening, Judith and myself and the then director, Miriam Krieger, sort of discussed the possibility of this platform, so it's fun to be part of it. On that evening also, I met a wonderful individual who became a great friend thereafter. That was Français. I'd very much like to dedicate this conversation to him. He was a wonderful presence in this institution, and we were all sad at his passing. Do I like Delhi? Well, as you may or may not know, I've just written this book about Delhi, which is a book of, I would say, significant levels of pain and anxiety about this city and my relationship to it. And I can't answer that question simply. I moved here in 2000, and everything that I've written has been in this city. The 3 books here on the table were all conceived and written in this city. And I probably wouldn't have written them had I not come to this city. I was living in New York before I came here, which was a place that I found it very difficult to imagine writing anything. I didn't feel there was anything I could add in literary terms to that place. And when I came here, I discovered a very different kind of cultural context where people had this amazing sense of their own possibilities, were very encouraging about writing, making films, and doing all the things that people did. So I'm very grateful to this city. Without it, I wouldn't be the person I am now. It's informed me in every kind of way. But this book is definitely a book of gloom and anxiety and
pessimism.
And pessimism. So
you don't think it's going to claw its way back? I don't think.
You know, I think the writing of the book, all these things, you have to cut them off at a certain point in time. And to be honest, just as I was finishing the book, I felt that the context around the book was changing. I feel we're actually at a somewhat different moment. The book tells the story from my arrival in this city and a moment that I found full of utopianism, of optimism, of a sense that anything was possible, and this was in every kind of community, the bohemians, the artists, the writers, the filmmakers, but also the business people, the politicians. There was a sense that not only was this city going to become something great and wonderful, but even this city might become something that could change the entire world. A year after I arrived, September 11th happened, and there was a sense that Western cities were actually in kind of crisis of their own. They were brittle, they were unable to deal with a lot of the kind of the shocks and influences of the 21st century. And maybe it was places like this that had such an incredible human variety that could teach those places something about how to be. And the book tells the story from that sort of excitement and euphoria into a kind of gloom. But I think we might have reached another stage beyond that, which is the stage the book doesn't talk about, which is, I think, a new stage of renewal.
But I'm going to return to my question, which is, and then I promise not to bug you anymore, Rana, but I do want an answer. Because Capital is so full of ambivalence, it's full of deep thinking about the city, that it's full of, that it does, like, people come, I always thought as a publisher that you write about the subjects you're passionate about. It doesn't mean that you love it. And it made me curious, I mean, do you feel you've recently come back from the States, and as you touched down, did you feel, oh, I'm back in Delhi, feeling of comfort, sigh of relief, you're home?
Well, yes, I've just been in the US for two months, and I touched down in Delhi and thought, is this what I come home to? I just looked around and thought, it's a weird place to be home. I think I am very passionate about this place, and the book is written. I think to some extent all my books are written against things as much as they're written for things. And I think that this book is written in a spirit of therapy. I mean, I felt that this city needed to be imagined. It needed to be laid out and codified in some kind of way so that we could actually act on the city. I think the city is full of deep kinds of neurosis and malaise and sickness, as well as all the forms of freedom and euphoria that we know living here. And so these are things that I wanted to address in the book to sort of grapple with the ugliness that is also part of this place.
You'll notice Rana does not give me easy answers. As which means I'll move on to my
next. What do you want me to say?
Yes, no, don't. But the other interesting thing about the book, interesting thing formally about the book, is that the book in a way has two components to it. One part is your thinking about the city. through reading, through meeting people. The other is a kind of series of conversations you've had with kind of characters that become big voices through which you tell why, through which you explain part of the kind of an aspect of the city. And of course, it's, in some ways, it's the most formally striking thing in your book is these long monologues, which are really conversations you've had with people. And I want you to tell us a little bit about a couple of things. One is that, what was it? Did you feel, let's start with the simplest thing, when you were meeting these people, did you feel that you, was it difficult to crack ice, to build a relationship with them?
No, it wasn't. And I think one of the reasons I let them talk at such length in the pages of this book is because I wanted people to hear how these people spoke, and I found it generally fantastic. I loved the voices of these people, and I think one of the things that's difficult to sense about a place like this from a long way away is how fast everything has happened and how quickly people have had to kind of catch up with themselves. Over the 15 years that I've lived in this city, it's completely transformed. The way that people live has been transformed, the landscape has been transformed, people's sense of what their life is about and where it can go has been completely changed. And so when you hear these people talk, you hear this incredible inner churn in their, they are at all times in this incredibly intense dialogue with themselves, constantly trying to catch up with the reality that's around them. And I think that's one of the things I loved about all the people I met, whether they were rich or poor, or men or women, or in whatever context, was that they had an inner life that I found extraordinary.
Did it take you by surprise when they confided in you? I mean, there was some of them, take the chapter about marriage and relationships. Some of these conversations were extremely private. You felt, I sometimes felt as, I was a voyeur. I mean, kind of with very, very intimate access into someone's life. Did it take you by surprise how much they told you?
One of the things I did when I first started writing this was to go and see lots of psychoanalysts and ask them, not for my own benefit, just to ask them what they thought were the subjects that one should think about in the city. And one of the psychoanalysts said to me, you shouldn't come to psychoanalysts to find out anything about the city, because the people that we see are people who have made a very un-Delhi kind of decision. And that's the decision to look inside themselves and to try and develop and heal. And I think that one of the amazing things I found about these conversations was they turned into therapy sessions. People would call me after we'd finished talking and say, look, there was lots of stuff I didn't tell you, can we meet again? And so they turned into these serial relationships where it was no longer clear who was the one driving it. And I began to feel that that a lot of people had a lot of stuff going on in their lives and in their heads that they weren't actually having conversations about in their normal lives. And I found it particularly with men. I found that women, they had obviously a more rehearsed vocabulary of things like intimate relationships and how they manage things like work and kids and husband and home, and that men were often talking about these things for the first time. That men had often, it seemed that men had a performance in front of other male friends, which was not necessarily what I discovered when I wasn't part of their world. I didn't go to school with them or that sort of thing, and I started asking them very direct questions about very intimate things.
And of course, one of the other interesting things about the way you present these monologues is, on one hand, the tone of it as you write it is very flat. It's presented in the way of a person who's saying, I'm going to give you these words, you must make your judgments, I'm going to say nothing. And at the same time, you make our judgments as readers almost instantly. And I always think as a writer, when you're trying to do two things at one time, so you say I'm going to be neutral, and at the same time you're going to make it possible for the reader not to be neutral. I always think that's very, if I had to write, I find that very hard. Did you find that hard? Is that something you thought about deliberately?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think we have a system in this place, in this country, in the city of enormous inequality, and of all kinds of things that are ugly in a systemic way. But the individuals, many of the individuals are totally fantastic. And I wanted to suspend judgment completely. I just thought that this is, one of the things I felt about writing about Delhi is that it's not an imagined place. We haven't seen it much in film, we haven't seen it much in literature, at least the Delhi of this century we've not seen much written about. Writers, when they approach Delhi, inevitably get drawn back into the Mughal times, because that's a time that already presents itself as literary. It was a literary society. It formulated itself in poetic terms and all that sort of thing. I feel that the society that we have here now is very difficult to formulate in terms that we can borrow from other cities. A lot of city writing in English or in European languages borrows from European cities and via the States. And I think that there are new city formations coming up in the world, of which Delhi is one, which we don't really know what it's all about yet. And so I didn't want to kind of approach it with preconceived judgments. A lot of journalists, because I've been talking about this book endlessly with journalists recently, a lot of journalists want there to be judgment. They want to say, they really want to force you and say, oh, those rich people from India, don't they eat babies and slaughter, are they just disgusting human beings? There's this sort of sense that there should be some kind of judgment. I don't know really what the judgments are. And so I want to suspend them and allow the reader to not play that role.
Rana, I was rereading your Granta piece. So Capital comes out of a brilliant long essay that Rana wrote for Granta magazine about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, something like that. And there's a character in the Granta piece where, and presented as a monologue. But there's a little bit in it where you're upset by what that character says. And I remember, it's fresh in my mind, thinking, oh, you made a kind of leap between that Granta piece and the book. Do you feel conscious that you made that leap, or did it happen all by itself?
What did I get upset about? I don't remember.
He said something and you said, I couldn't believe he was saying that. He said,
right.
You had a phrase like that, which, you put yourself, if you read Capital, there's large chunks of text and then there's no sense of what Rana's thinking. And of course, that Rana's aware, he's present in these conversations. But he's he's the invisible person in this, which is what gives the book its tension. So I don't, maybe it's something we can come back to later. I sprung it on you. But I don't know whether you remember, whether you made a journey where somewhere in some of these conversations you thought, as you were writing down, that you thought to push yourself right back. Is that something you thought?
Yeah, I think, the first article was a more journalistic piece. It had a much more journalistic feel about it. I think what the book is a more novelistic approach, and it's much more sympathetic towards characters. I think, again, it's also, somebody at the Jaipur Festival said, why do you not use the word nouveau riche to describe your characters? Because like a lot of other people, this person wanted more categorization, wanted people to put in boxes so we would know how to approach them. And I feel that I don't actually know how to approach them. So one of the things is the idea of taste. There's a sense that people, the nouveau riche, one of the characteristics of the nouveau riche is they have bad taste, and they haven't been rich long enough to have good taste. I no longer even know if it's possible to say that anymore. I don't even know where good taste comes from or who decides it anymore. When you look at a world that's arisen so fast as the world that I describe in the book, you start wondering if this really is good taste, these crystal tables and all this kind of thing. It's consciously modeled after Russian oligarchs. That's the idea. That's the ideal. But if you look at the design, my favorite example is the design of Bentleys and Rolls Royces. These used to be designed with sort of classical Greek pillars in the front, and they consciously invoked the English aristocracy. And now they look like gangster cars, and they're clearly made with kind of rappers and criminals in mind. And even people who make their money legitimately enjoy that kind of criminal edge to money. And it feels like Russian oligarchs are producing taste for everybody, not just for themselves. So I feel that one of the questions about looking at new places like this is precisely the question of judgment. Does your judgment hold up when it's faced by a world like this? And I wasn't prepared to kind of impose pre-existing judgments on this world.
You would even tempt, it's easy to sort of withhold judgment in matters of aesthetics, but is it as easy to withhold judgment in moral matters?
Well, I think the question of gender in the book is dealt with clear judgment. I mean, one of the things that happened to me while I was writing the book is that I found that I was talking to men and women who lived in completely different cities. And so gender moved to the center of the book, which was not my intention when I started writing it. And the stories of gender violence and in small and large ways, I mean, I think by the weight they're given in the book, there's a clear judgment implied in these kind of things.
There's apart from the conversations you're having with people in Delhi, there's another person you're having a conversation with through the book, and that's your father.
Right.
And for me as a reader, it's one of the best, kind of the most really properly moving bits in the book. Was it interesting to talk to your father as a character? To see him not as your father, but as a man who was making his life in London, falling in love with your mother. Was that an interesting? Did you always see him like that?
Well, actually, I've been doing interviews with my dad for years, even before I thought of this book. He lives in England, I live here, so I didn't see him that often, and every time I'd go back, I'd do a few hours of interviews, and we sort of progressed gradually through the decades, because his life was quite amazing, and because I think I'm of a generation with a worse memory than him, so I probably won't remember all the stories that he tells me. And I thought it would be nice, if nothing else, just have a CD of these tales that I could pass on to my own children or whatever. There's a great thing about having a tape recorder, even in a relationship with your parents, because it alters the relationship completely. You're no longer a child speaking to a parent. You are an interviewer, an objective interviewer. And it was important to him, I think, to be able to speak about these things in that kind of context. He's a great storyteller, but he doesn't really know how to record these things himself. So he moved from India to the UK, and I moved in the opposite direction. So he's somewhere in the background of all this, and part of the book is also trying to understand this shift that I have made. So ultimately, yes, it goes back in time to him.
Was it, did he enjoy reading about himself?
He was very anxious about these tales circulating widely. I mean, they're tales which I think to any reader who is not connected to him are charming and impressive, because he's an impressive man. But in his own life, they're bound up with intense humiliation. The humiliation is associated, excuse me, is associated with the falling off of his family from middle class prosperity into dire poverty, which put him into situations that he spent the rest of his life trying to escape from, and making sure that he's never going to fall into again. And having those situations invoked in a way that everyone can read them, he finds. So a lot of people have been coming up to him at book parties and congratulating him on all the amazing things that they read about him, and he doesn't know where to look, because some level he's happy about this book, sort of talking about these things. And in another way, these are precisely the things he's been trying to conceal and move away from all his life.
Was it easy for you to have those conversations with him?
I think it was more difficult for him. My father broke down many times while I was having these conversations with him, and I think he thought that I might, I think he thinks that these are things that you don't want your children to be exposed to, and you can continue that sort of protection far into your children's life. And I think he thought that it would be painful for me, but I think it was really painful for him. He's held on to these things for a long time.
One of the things that, one of the fallouts from Suketumeda's Maxim City is that the characters he put in his books, a bunch of them hated up and hating the book and hating him as a result. I'm putting it simply, but I mean, the short answer is that we've had these long conversations of trust with people, then they see themselves in print, and even if it's generous, it's always a complicated thing for them. Did any of your characters respond badly to the book?
I mean, this is the terrifying thing about writing non-fiction when you've written 2 works of fiction before, that your fictional characters will never sort of come up, kind of call you up and make threats or anything like that. This is what's kept me awake at night for a long time. I mean, it's very, there are people, as you say, who have given away very intimate things about themselves. There's one woman character in particular who I feel, though I go a long way to protect her identity and everything, I feel possibly gave away information that could put her in danger. And so where you draw the line is very tough. But to date, no one has reacted badly, but there's still time.
You have to watch this space for fresh controversy.
I mean, Manish Arora, the fashion designer, who came to the book party, he picked up the book and asked me which page he had to turn to, and went away and sat in the corner and read it. And he came back and he was delighted, and he put his arms around me and hugged me and was very moved and said, "But that's exactly what I said. And that's exactly who I am." And then he corrected himself and said, "That's not who I am, that's who I was 2 years ago, and I'm so grateful that we preserved it." So that's the good outcome.
You said, you just talked about being a novelist, writing nonfiction. One thing that surprised me about the book is that it doesn't feel like a novelist is writing nonfiction. And by that I mean that, there's a way in which the book is about sort of big ideas, big questions you had about the city that you wanted answered. And you answered it through reading, or you answered it through meeting people, and then you want to come to the heart of it. I mean, you kind of almost treated it academically. It felt to me that the way this book was is that you want to slice through this miasma of the city and find this kind of little center. While a novelist often the novelist is the person who feels the miasma. But I wonder if you agree or disagree.
Well, I deliberately didn't write a novel. I mean, I could have written a novel, and I didn't. And the reason was because I felt that, I really felt that a documentary project was in order. I felt that the 10 years that had happened around me were extraordinary years, in which everything had changed in people's lives, and their values, and in the structure of their families, and the landscape around them, and that it should be recorded. And I also felt that if I went out and talked to people, that I shouldn't presume what was going on in people's lives. I shouldn't make it up, because I felt it was probably much wilder and more intense than I could make up. So, for instance, I don't know if how many of you have read the book, but there's one character, for instance, who I go and meet because someone has told me that he's an interesting guy, and this is how a lot of these kind of encounters happen. So we have a conversation. He owns a little property. His family owns a little property in Shahpujat. So there's some rental income coming in, but he wants to be super, super rich, and he's got all kinds of schemes for doing so. And we go and meet at a bar in Defense Colony, and afterwards he calls me and he says that if I really want to hear what he's about and what he has to say, we can't meet in bars. He doesn't do bars, he can't talk in bars, he doesn't feel comfortable around people. I have to go to the sort of places where he hangs out. So the sort of places that he hangs out are Nehru Park at 1 in the morning with a bottle of vodka on his own in January when it's freezing cold. And that's where we spend sort of 2 or 3 hours. And one of the reasons he goes to Nehru Park in the middle of the night is to visit the dogs, who are the most intense relationships in his life. So he goes to Nehru Park with kebabs, which he gets made without spices, and he takes them from the nearby kebab stand to the park and then gives them out to the dogs. When he's in bed and it starts raining, he gets in his car and rushes to Nehru Park to put up a tarpaulin so the dog can shelter under it. And essentially this guy, from all his money-making attempts, has become so devastated by human relations that he is obsessed by animals, by dogs especially. He's broken men's jaws when he's seen them throwing stones at dogs in the street. I couldn't make a character like this up, and so it was really about a documentary project. It was really about trying to engage with the reality and try to understand it as it is. And I think, I agree with you and disagree with you. I mean, I think there are aspects of it that are novelistic. I mean, I think the way that the river becomes an image, the way that water becomes an image throughout the book for the structure of the city and the history of the city and human relations is a novelistic gesture. And I think that the way marriage also, I mean, one of the things that inspired me in the writing of this book is the way that Europeans have written about cities like Petersburg or Paris or Berlin in the 19th and 20th centuries. So people in this audience will know better than me the poem in prose by Baudelaire called, I think it's called Les Yeux des Pauvres, the Eyes of the Poor, in which Baudelaire recounts a moment when he's sitting with a lover in one of the new cafes in 1860s Paris. Haussmann has just broken down the city and built these huge boulevards. The whole city is rubble. All these people have been made homeless by this incredible upheaval in the city, and this sparkling new infrastructure of boulevards and boutiques and cafes has opened up. So Baudelaire is sitting in one of these cafes. It's got these kind of mirrors and these painted ceilings, and he's with this woman. And while they're sitting there together, this man who's been made homeless by the whole upheaval comes and stands nearby, and he's gazing up into this cafe with his 2 kids, and he's asking for money. And Baudelaire's lover talks about how disgusting it is that this man should come so close to them and look at them in this way. And Baudelaire's desire for this woman is immediately extinguished because he feels that a woman with so little empathy just doesn't arouse him in it at all, doesn't arouse his interest at all. And I love the way that Baudelaire uses these very tiny moments, just an evening between a man and a woman, to paint a huge reality. So marriage for me too was another thing which you see, because I actually look more at divorce than at marriage, and everything is present in divorce, values and property and money and everything. So I hope there's something of the novelist in it.
Did you, and then we'll move on to the other books and then to kind of all your writing, but I want to end with a question that mirrors my first, and did you find writing it difficult? Did you find thinking in that particular way, in both a novelist's way, but in a reporter's way, difficult?
I think it's definitely a book of someone who's come to the city, not of somebody who's born in the city. It's so. And I started writing it when I've been living in the city for 11 years. And I think anyone who comes to a city that's very different from their own is in a constant inner dialogue with the city, asking the city why it is as it is, and asking oneself what is valuable about the place you've come from, that you want to hold on to, and what was not valuable about the place that you come from, what is better about this place that you wish to embrace and replace those parts of yourself with. And so when I actually came to writing this book, it was actually quite easy. I felt I've been rehearsing it for years and years and years, and it was the easiest thing I've written. I mean, definitely much easier than my previous books.
I wonder whether we should have some readings before I ask Rana some questions about all the other difficult novels.
Sure. Is it me first? Yeah. So before Capital, I wrote two books. The first came out in 2005, and it was a collection of
You're going to read Solo too?
of folk tales set in contemporary cities. And then in 2009, I had this book, Solo, which was a novel set in Bulgaria. Should I do both readings now, or just one? I'll do one now.
Yeah, do one. Do you want to do it?
I'll do Solo, and then Monsieur Boutin can just... So I'm going to stand at the podium first. Is this my time? So I'm going to read from the second chapter of Solo, which I have read in this room before, and it's quite fun to do again. I always find that the last book I've written I just can't bear looking at, but the ones before that are quite fun to look at. So I'm going to read a couple of chapters which set up the scene of the city of Sofia, where this book is set, the capital of Bulgaria, which is sort of midway between my two countries, between Britain and India. The man is called Ulrich. The absurdity of this name can be blamed on his father, who had a love affair with all things German. Over the years, a lot of time has gone into explaining it. Ulrich was born here in Sofia, in an imposing house on Don Lukov Boulevard, just opposite the Shumenska restaurant. Ulrich's father built the house in the Viennese style during his years of affluence. He employed an Austrian architect and had the facade plastered with lyres and urns overflowing with fruit, and the bold-faced year, 1901. In those days, men like Ulrich's father, the men in suits and hats, were the minority in Sofia. They were outnumbered by the pigs and donkeys and the kerchiefed peasants driving poultry and pumpkins. They were outshone by the august Jewish and Armenian merchants who struck business deals amid scented smoke, silks, and spittoons. They could barely understand the speech of the women at the market stalls who sat jangling with iron hoops. The rhythms of commerce were supplied not by the opening times of their banks, but by the gaited camels, which came in trains from all over the Ottoman Empire to provide carpets and gold to the Turkish traders around the Banyabashi Mosque. And they were powerless against the gypsies, who took over the city now and then, assembling in an afternoon a swarming settlement of skinned tents and fires, filling the bazaars with curiosities from abroad, and sowing restless thoughts among the children. But the men in suits had plans for expansion. As the Ottoman Empire's tide retreated, Sofia found itself beached in Europe. And these men plotted to turn their provincial Turkish town into a new European capital city. They studied Berlin and Paris to find out what was required, and all of it, cathedral, tramway, university, royal palace, science museum, national theatre, national assembly, they recreated faithfully in Sofia. At the entrances to the future metropolis were haystacks piled up like mountains to sustain the multitudes of horses carrying stone and steel for the new constructions. And traders and labourers swarmed over the swampy void left by everything that had been torn down. Ulrich's father was a railway engineer. He'd had the good fortune in his youth to study engineering at the mining school at Freiburg in Moravia, and his career was begun on the Vienna-Constantinople railway line built by Baron de Hirsch. By the time of Ulrich's earliest memories, his father was engaged across Anatolia and Mesopotamia under Philip Holzmann, the contractor for Deutsche Bank's enormous railway investments in the Ottoman Empire, who appointed him senior engineer on the new line from Berlin to Baghdad. For Ulrich's father, there was no calling more noble, more philosophical than the railways. As he dreamed, his moustache trembled with the snaking of glinting rails across continents. Next to the churches, synagogues and mosques, he saw new edifices hatching roofs of steel and glass, and departure boards unfolding within, full of the promise of discovery. In the ecstasy of his reverie, he hovered above the cartoon face of the planet, now wrapped in twin lines of steel, and given over, finally, to science and understanding. When he took a journey, he traveled second class in order to encounter the awestruck families in traditional clothes who found themselves in a railway carriage for the very first time. He eavesdropped on their anxious commentaries. He grunted conspicuously and shook his head. And while Ulrich's mother gave her husband discouraging flicks with her gloves, he waited for the right moment to intervene. "I beseech you all, fear not," he began grandiloquently. "This is a scientific road, built according to the principles of Newton, and should we travel at triple this speed, still we would come to no harm." Having verified to his satisfaction that all mindless chatter had ceased, he stood up to address the company. "You good and simple folk, who have never travelled faster than the poor horse could drag you through the mud, are lucky to see this day, when suddenly you are plucked up and propelled as fast as thought. Treasure this moment, and think upon this speed which now sends your minds descending into chasms of terror, for this is the rumbling inside you of the new age." When some village woman drew her shawl around her and complained of the nausea that the flashing landscape produced in her stomach, he pointed at the stomach and adjured her. "Do not look at the poppies outside your window, madam, for they race more rapidly than your senses can apprehend. Look instead at the church spires and mountains in the distance, whose movements are more steady. For this is the vision of our new times. We have been liberated from the myopia that kept human beings peering at their own miserable patch of earth, bound to proclaim with sword and drum its superiority to every other. From now on they will see far and look upon a common future." As the unfortunate target of this outburst withdrew farther under her wrappings, a meek husband would draw the fire gallantly to himself, asking some timid question about how rails were laid or how signals operated, to which Ulrich's father gave long and ecstatic answers, gesticulating with the loftiness of the spirit within him, and drawing technical diagrams for the edification of his audience. Whenever the newspaper arrived in the morning with the story of a railway accident, it would throw him into a temper for days. He cursed the drowsy signalmen or drunken drivers who betrayed the scientific age with idiocy, mutilations, and death. "These abominations will cease," he would retort angrily when anyone chose to engage him on the subject. "It is only a matter of time." Much of Ulrich's childhood was spent in train compartments and hotels, following his father's work. The entire household set out for weeks on end, journeying to where the tracks gave out. There were the armies of the workers, thousands of them, tented in the brushland under a dome of dust that signaled their labor for miles around. Italians, Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Arabs, Kurds, and others from all over the empire, hammering at the desert floor under the supervision of turbaned envoys from the Sublime Porte and handlebar-moustached German engineers. Crowds of cooks, doctors, prostitutes, fruit sellers, musicians, tobacco sellers, and dancers advanced with them along the envisioned highway. And as the daylight expired, an endless congregation of wood fires sprang to life under the stars. Chickens and goats were thrust on spits, and great iron cauldrons were set upon the flames. Everywhere men were eating, joking, sleeping, arguing, and hissing, while packs of camels and horses looked dispassionately on. This was the assembly that hauled the silver lines from the mouth of the metropolis as across the scrub of Anatolia, and Ulrich's father could weep with the grandeur of it. The earliest memory Ulrich still retains is this. He is lying alone at night under translucent canvas, a blanket folded carefully around him. At the edge of his hearing is the hubbub of the multitude, and he watches the twitching shape of a lizard on the roof above him, outlined by the lapping firelight. The brightness of his eyes comes not from these things, however, but from the sounds of the musicians. Even at this age, he does not need to see the dancing to know what reflexes the music induces in the men's bodies. After so many years, the melodies have drained away, but he can still recall their effect on his tucked-up child flesh. He stores another memory from that time, or shortly after, his father's temper in a cafe in Constantinople when politics interfered with his work. If the British Empire is so fragile that a pair of steel rails can bring it down, then let it fall. Though they threaten us because we approach their roots, because we near their India, their precious Suez Canal, we are here to bring the peoples of the world together, and such a mission will stand before any rebuke. He stamped on the floor with the injustice of it, and Ulrich learned it was possible to be angry with people one did not know. Ulrich's father's idealism proved to be a liability in the long run. When, during the Great War, the British destroyed the railway tracks he had helped to build, he took it as a personal calamity, as if the charges had been set at his own nerve junctions, and he fretted about it for the rest of his life. Trying to pull his country as fast as possible out of Asia, he never thought he would be raised by an excess of Europe. Thank you. I think we're going to
L'homme s'appelle Ulrich. Ce prénom absurde, il le doit à son père, amoureux de tout ce qui venait de l'Allemagne. Au cours des années, il a passé beaucoup de temps à s'en expliquer. Ulrich est né ici, à Sofia, dans une imposante demeure du boulevard Dondukov, juste en face du restaurant Tchulenska. Son père avait fait construire cette maison dans le style viennois pendant ses années fastes. Il avait engagé un architecte autrichien et fait décorer la façade de lyres et d'urnes débordantes de fruits en stuc, sans oublier l'année en caractère bien visible, 1901. À cette époque, les hommes comme le père d'Ulrich, les hommes portant complet veston et chapeau, n'étaient qu'une minorité à Sofia. Ils étaient bien moins nombreux que les cochons, les ânes et les paysannes en fichu qui venaient vendre volailles et citrouilles au marché. Et ils faisaient bien pâle figure à côté des vénérables marchands juifs et arméniens qui concluaient leurs affaires dans un nuage de tabac parfumé entouré de soieries et de crachoirs. Ils comprenaient à peine la langue des femmes du marché, toutes cliquetantes d'anneaux métalliques. Le commerce était rythmé non par les heures d'ouverture de leur banque, mais par le pas des chameaux venus en caravane de tout l'Empire ottoman pour apporter orgues et tapis aux marchands turcs installés autour de la mosquée Bania Pachi. Ils étaient impuissants face aux tziganes qui, de temps en temps, envahissaient la ville, montant en un après-midi un campement fourmillant de tentes en peau et de feux de bivouac qui remplissaient les bazars de curiosités venues de l'étranger et ensemençaient de rêves d'évasion l'esprit des enfants. Mais les hommes en complet veston avaient des projets d'expansion. Le refus du raz-de-marée ottoman avait laissé Sofia échouer en Europe. Et eux manigançaient de transformer cette ville de province turque en nouvelle capitale européenne. Ils étudièrent l'exemple de Berlin et de Paris, puis s'appliquèrent à tout recréer fidèlement chez eux, la cathédrale, le tramway, l'université, le palais royal, le muséum, le théâtre national, le parlement. Des meules de foin hautes comme des montagnes s'élevèrent aux portes de la future métropole pour nourrir la multitude de chevaux qui apportaient les pierres et l'acier destinés aux nouvelles constructions, tandis que les vendeurs et ouvriers envahissaient les marécages qui remplaçaient à présent les quartiers démolis.
Rana, I think of you as an, this is going to sound banal, but I think of you as an ambitious writer. And by that I mean that when I read your books, I think you haven't always just thought about, oh, how am I going to make a character come alive? How do I make the story and the narrative compelling? But you start with, what is the biggest thing I'm trying to do with the book? What is my largest aim? Do you agree? And then you be modest.
Well, I imagine that all writers do things like that. I mean, what's the point of devoting 4 years to your life to something that's not the biggest thing you can imagine, the grandest thing you can imagine? It's true that this book that I've just read from was definitely the most ambitious thing I've ever done. And it dealt with the geography. There was not at all my own geography of a country that I didn't know at all. I had to do a huge amount of research and everything. And it had sort of very significant kind of connections to the moment in which it was written. So the section we've just heard, in which we are following a railway track that's being built from Berlin to Baghdad, was all being written while the Iraq War was going on. And in that context, the idea of a railway track from Berlin to Baghdad seemed an incredibly romantic thing. And the grandeur that the novel gives it was because it seemed grand in my mind. The possibility of this intimate link between Europe and the Middle East, funded by Deutsche Bank, seemed spectacular to me at that time, and far away. So in many ways, the book was trying to invert an idea of the 20th century. Because at the very beginning of the 20th century, there's a sense of the enormous connectivity of things. By the end, things are very small and isolated.
So let me, when I say ambitious, I mean that what would have come first, Ulrich, or this idea of feeling that you stumbled upon this idea of the railway line, of it sort of having resonance with the politics of the. And so the reason I ask this is because the book, each book you've written is completely different from the others. Each book displays not. There are books where there's kind of one of the things that's striking about them is the kind of great deal of thinking that's gone behind it. And when I call you ambitious, I mean that it's not. I'm not saying that Alice Munro wrote novels, short stories about couples who end their marriages. This is not to say that great art can happen out of it, but one gets the feeling from reading your books that there are the creative impulses come from somewhere else. The deepest sort of the ideals you have, or when it comes to writing and what you want to do with your writing, comes from other places. Perhaps ambition is the wrong word. But
well, I think that what basically I find out who I am through writing, and I find out what the world is about through writing. I'm attached to this act of writing, not just in a way that sort of makes my living or produces a product, but in a way that I am through it. I don't have a set of thoughts or a story that pre-exists the writing and then I just write it down. I find out through writing what I think, what I want to say. So all the themes that you're talking about are themes that I am grappling with in the act of writing. And one of the and really the theme is what is the picture of the world? How do we represent the world to ourselves and imagine it? Ulrich came as a sort of technical device. I mean, I wanted to tell 100 years of history, and so I needed a 100-year-old man. And it's only later on that I discovered that actually Bulgaria happens to be a country where there are lots of 100-year-old people, because it's just one of the healthiest places on the planet to live. And so, in fact, there are lots of 100-year-old people that you can go and talk to, which is kind of extraordinary. And also, I think that as I wrote this book, this character became very bizarrely real to me. I mean, I would sort of go to sleep. I would do a lot of the creation of the book in this mode between awake and sleep, and I would sort of lie waiting for this character to sort of visit me, and he was just on the other side of this sort of veil, and he would basically come at the end of the day and tell me that everything I'd written that day was false, and that I had to work harder and kind of get to know this character better. So he became this sort of strange alter ego, and writing this book for 4 years, I was in a bit of I was really in the company of ghosts, and I was not much company for real people.
Did you, when the ghost said to you that Bulgaria is where you must set your book, were you scared? Did you think, why am I doing this?
No, that was just an obsession, which pre-existed the ghost. I started listening to some Bulgarian music, and I started reading about Bulgarian music, and I just felt there's something in this place that I need to find out about, and I didn't know what it was, and I just started visiting there. Growing up in England, there was a moment in the 70s when a lot of tourists started going to Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, which the Black Sea coast was a kind of, and they all came back and said that Bulgaria was the most boring place on earth. And that sort of became the British idea of Bulgaria. And I always think that when there's a consensus that something has no interest, then it must be very interesting. You have to go and find out why everyone is denying it in that sort of energetic way. So I found that it was an amazing place. I mean, I also was writing this at a very significant time, which was 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. All these stories were starting to come out. The Secret Service archives were just being opened. People were finding out from those archives which of their neighbors had reported on them. And so, for the first time, all these stories were being told, and people were very fresh and ready to tell stories. And you could sit down with pretty much anyone in the street and ask them about their family, and it would be extraordinary, because there was always one brother who joined the fascists, another brother who joined the communists, and they sort of jailed each other, killed each other. And those stories had never been told until this time.
Was there a moment where you said, oh, I shouldn't be the one doing it? I should just write a nice novel about defense colony rather than put my imagination in. So I go back to your kind of ambition is, did you, when something in your mind said, let's go to Bulgaria, was there a moment of diffidence saying, oh, Bulgaria is not for me, I should be? Does that ever, are you limited by that ever?
Well, I think part of it, I'm a bit of a contrarian. I think that, I don't really think that, there's an idea if you have an Indian name and you live in India that you have to write about Indian stuff. And I resist this categorization. My French editor, of, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me telling the story, but the French editor of Tokyo Council really hoped, because he's a big Indiophile, that I would then write this big Indian novel. And when he heard that I was writing a novel about Bulgaria, he was horrified. And he said, Rana, do you hate your father? Because he's French. So there has to be a psychoanalytic aspect to the kind of answer. So I said that I didn't hate my father at all. And he said, because only a man who hated his father would reject his own culture in this terrible way. And I said, well, I am also European. I grew up in Europe, and this is a European novel. This was something he could never really get his head around. He kept wanting me to apply for visas to visit France because he forgot that I was a British citizen. So, there was a lot of other people who didn't want me to write about Bulgaria, but I always felt completely at ease with this subject.
Because you could, what you're saying is that you come to a book by a problem or a question in your head, or a fascination or an interest in a subject, and that draws you in.
The thing is, one shouldn't imagine that it's not personal because it's set in a place that's not my own. I mean, this is actually an incredibly autobiographical novel. I mean, I grew up in a place where part of me was from the mainstream culture and part of me wasn't. And I grew up in a very white, quaint English town, Cambridge, where I was the only non-white person in my school. And I had this sort of secret story in addition to the official story. And I identify with with minor narratives. And Bulgaria is very much a minor narrative. I was living in a very big country. I'd recently moved from another very big country, the United States. And I really found a lot of myself in this very small country of 8 million people, a country that fears that its language will be wiped away, that it will be swallowed by another country. I found a lot of myself in it.
But I'll tell you what, and what I find interesting about the way you talk about it is that, so I'm going to go quote unquote normal. The normal way to say it is you say things like, I moved to Delhi, I was terribly homesick, I miss my parents, I miss my friends, I did this. Look at the way you've been talking about Bulgaria, or even why you're drawn to it, or why Ulrich and the character you've written. You said the picture you've drawn is one of it's what makes you and your writing special. Far more complex. I mean, I'm not saying that the solo is terribly moving. It's a novel about a lonely man, and it does it as well as any book does. But your impulses to write come from somewhere much more cerebral than many other writers. I mean, would you acknowledge that, or am I overreading it?
Yeah, I think I start with concepts and I fill them up with characters and emotions and experiences. You're right. It could also be that I just want that it's easier to take over a small country than to conquer a big country. And I found when I went to launch this book in Bulgaria that I had taken over Bulgaria. I became this massive rock star. And I thought maybe I could sort of then write my Cyprus novel and my kind of Liechtenstein novel and sort of just take over the world by stealth, as it were.
And does that mean you're going to resist the Delhi novel, or indeed the Indian novel?
It was very interesting to go to Bulgaria with this novel because I was terrified that I got lots of stuff wrong. But the interesting thing is that Bulgarian writers do not write about Bulgaria because there's this feeling that. I mean, actually, what I was worried about going to Bulgaria was that the novel is very melancholy, and I was worried that it was too melancholy for Bulgarians, that I sort of invented this melancholy nation for my own purposes. Actually, when I went there, it was just plain depressed. It was far more melancholy than I could possibly imagine. And so Bulgarian writers looked around them and saw nothing that they could possibly write about. They saw it as a totally barren place, and they tried to write about Bulgaria, but they ended up writing about America or Britain, and and usually Bulgarian characters in those places. So when I would go to parties where there were all these sort of Bulgarian writers, they couldn't understand how I had seen anything of value in this place to write about. And so I think in addition to concepts and sort of starting with cerebral things, I also start with strange instincts. Where I really am attracted to things that are where there is a consensus that there is nothing there, that it's all been done or it's empty, and I want to find the story in there. I want to find those, as I said, those minor stories.
There's been this recent debate about in a magazine called N+1 about global novels and world novels, and an idea that I'm not going to necessarily be able to say perfectly, but this idea that there is a group of writers now who write for a global audience. They write. It's almost as if they don't write for their own country. Their entire life is dedicated to, but to kind of to depicting that country for readers not in that country. But at the same time, the article talks about whether there is such a thing as a world literature. And one thing that's interesting about your career is that you can't be placed anywhere. It goes back to your instinct that you're a contrarian in your deepest impulses. Is that something you feel proud of? That you never want to say you could in 15 years be somewhere in the Arctic or something, and this feels entirely plausible to you, the way you see yourself and your future.
Yeah, but it's not just out of resisting what is expected of you. I mean, I basically think that nation states are sort of holograms or illusions. The fact is that the texture of our life is spread out across the planet. We know that we're connected to people all over the planet in all kinds of ways, in terms of information technology, in terms of economic processes. So, so not to write a literature that expands in that same space seems to me dishonest. I don't think that we really just exist in local, in a bounded and local sense. So this idea of world literature for me is not just about trying to resist people's expectations of what is appropriate to you, but also to try and create something that might be a world culture in some sense. I think we have a world system, a world machine, but we don't really have a world culture. A world culture would be that thing that would allow us to feel that we are culturally connected to all those people that we are also economically connected to, and allow for all kinds of political processes and moral processes to be unleashed, where currently there are only raw economic processes. So the creation of a world culture, the creation of unexpected links between, say, Bulgaria and India, which rather than expected links between, say, America and India, is to me to expand our ideas of who we're connected to and what forms of empathy we're capable of. I think the idea that I can feel myself into the life of a 100-year-old Bulgarian man is a sort of, it's not only a creative test, it's a moral test. And that is the moral test I also want the reader to set themselves.
Well, you, in a way, you're really describing your first novel. Tokyo Cancelled
Right.
there's a book of where stories join up to other worlds. It's Tokyo Cancelled. Were you, when you were writing it, could you have been as articulate as you are being now about why and how you write, or did that happen wholly kind of instinctively?
No, I think, I don't think I would have said all that 10 years ago, but I think, so Tokyo Cancelled is modeled on Boccaccio or Chaucer's, modeled on these medieval sets of tales where a bunch of people, travelers in Chaucer's case, come together and tell stories of different places. So in Chaucer's case, these stories are drawn from all over Europe, all over Christendom. And I felt that the amazing sense of possibilities of communication that these travelers have between themselves should also be something that we could explore in global space. After all, we also have all kinds of connections to each other. And so Tokyo Cancelled has stories from Lagos and Buenos Aires and New York and Paris and London, and they are modern-day travelers trying to find a universal language which they find in the form of a folktale and fairy tale. So yes, I mean, it's very much the same project. The project of trying to connect through literature places that are not otherwise thought to be culturally connected.
Do you see yourself as a moral writer? There's something moral about this idea.
Moral or political? Yes, I mean, I do think that, I mean, a lot of the characters in Tokyo Cancelled are also, because I think that I remember feeling while reading while I was writing Tokyo Cancelled that there were more refugees in the world at that point, in 2000 roughly, than in 1945. And we think of 1945 as a moment of global catastrophe. But the year 2000, before even 9/11, was normal. And so our 21st century normal was more catastrophic in these terms than 1945. And so there are lots of refugees, there are lots of people in the book who are these sailors, illegal immigrants, refugees, prostitutes. These are the normal characters of global capitalism. There are also billionaires and film stars, but they all inhabit the same space. So pushing to the center of our picture of the world, these people, refugees and sailors, all these people that we sort of shut out of our imagination, felt to me deeply political, and the idea of treating them as heroes, treating them as people with moral sensibilities, yes, it was absolutely, I was striking out against the way that we represented our world.
Rana, I wonder whether we should end with you reading from Tokyo Press.
Very briefly, I will read the opening of one story. So this one is set in Lagos, and it's called The Flyover. I'm just going to read a couple of pages. In the city of Lagos, there was once a young man named Marlborough. He lived in a small room on Lagos Island, near to the hustle and bustle of the Logan Market, with his mother and two elder brothers. The eldest brother was devoted to learning, and managed to get money together to go to a reputable university in India. The second brother had a friend who ran errands for rich people. They set up a booth together on Victoria Island. Bills paid, visas made, no more stress, trustworthy service, receipt always given, no job too big or too small. Soon the commute became too much, and he set up a bed in his stall. Marlborough was alone with his mother. "Why don't you go and improve yourself like your brothers?" she would say. She worked long hours in a beer parlor and had no time for Marlborough's laziness. He would lie on her bed while she was out, under a crinkled poster of Jesus standing on a rainbow, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And he would watch lizards sitting on the fluorescent tube, waiting for flies. If you can only find your own fluorescent light to sit on, thought Marlborough, then everything comes to you. In fact, everything did come to Marlborough, but he was generally thought to have authority, and his evenings were full with people bringing him cups of ginger juice or measures of whiskey in return for advice on how they could improve their luck in business or love. Everyone talked to him, discussed who was making money and how, who was honest and who was a cheat, and one person's problem always turned out to be the next person's solution. He gained a reputation. "Why don't you tell me who my father was?" Marlborough would ask late at night as his mother put up her cerise toenail feet that perfectly matched her cerise lipstick. Excuse me. The air in this city is terrible to come back to. And flicked between soap operas, turned up to full volume to cover the scream of the flyover outside. "Maybe if you make something of your life, I will. It can't do anyone any good right now. Maybe if I knew who my father was, I would make something of my life." There was certainly an unaccounted for influence in his mother's fortunes, for how could a woman with her income and status start spending her mornings at the Air Hostess Academy learning how to fly in planes? Surely it could not be her undeniable beauty alone that allowed her to cheat fate so dramatically. How could she suddenly be taking flights to Riyadh, Johannesburg, New York, and London? Marlborough affected indifference towards the vile speculation about his mother's ruses that arrived on his doorstep every evening, but he was secretly mystified at how it had all happened. She would return with bars of Swiss chocolate that she would eat delicately in front of the National Geographic Channel, giving only listless hints of endless avenues of glinting shops in return for Marlborough's circuitous questioning. One evening, while she was away in Frankfurt or Rome, a one-eyed man came to the door and handed Marlborough a business card. "Come, tomorrow, Mr. Bundu would like to make a proposition." Mr. Bundu offered Marlborough whiskey, which he gladly accepted, and sat him on a greasy red velvet sofa. "I have heard about you. Seems you have authority, a reputation. Wondering how I can make use of that."
What business are you in, Mr. Bundu? Think of the flyovers by Boulogne Market, near your house. What a bazaar under those cement awnings. Do you know how much cash changes hands? Monument to the human spirit, Marlborough, the buzzing conversation of trade. But if you laid out all the great chains of being that end up in a place like that, you know what I'm saying. Moon and back several times. Complexities will strain your mind. Who owns which traders? Who's got the monopoly on buses or prostitutes? Which foreign company is the government trying to impress? Who's Hausa? Who's Yoruba? Who owns the police chief? Which products are producing inadequate returns in all this space? Whose supply just dried up in Taiwan? Who's behind the latest Surulere movie? Excuse me. Who's bought the blindness of the most eyes? Phew, it's a whole universe. It is the whole universe. A worthy challenge for the intellect, don't you think? You're very right, Mr. Bundu. Oh, it's a scintillating world. It's a pyramid of mercury. And we have to stand on top. Don't want to be paying out too many cuts to people above us. We want to collect them all ourselves. I work for a very powerful man, Marlborough. That's him in the picture. On the wall was a photograph of the multi-millionaire businessman, King Lord Bombata, shaking hands with the French Prime Minister. I've forgotten that part. King Lord was wearing king-size Gucci sunglasses, and Marlborough thought to himself, there is a man I could look up to. Mr. Bombata is like you and me, Marlborough. Likes good systems. Doesn't like it when there are leaks. Get me 10% of all the deals in those markets, Bundu, he says. But we need more information, Marlborough. Strategic thinking. I have boys who are very committed. They've done some great work, but the money's just not coming in. You have a reputation. Do you think you can help? I certainly do, Mr. Bundu. It would be an honor.
Questions to everyone?
Thank you for capital. I lived in Delhi in the 50s. And 60s. And I returned recently. Couldn't understand the city and why it had changed so much. So your book really explained lots of things very deeply. And I couldn't also wait to get back to it. I would read a bit every night. Do that at night. Is this the only time you have for yourself? And I just couldn't wait to get back every night to read that little bit of Captain. So thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about, I know you probably don't want to talk about your most recent book, but I haven't read the others. That story about Gurgaon and how it came up, and the fact that the DLF person, although that's not mentioned as DLF, he actually went around and paid these farmers in cash because they didn't accept anything else. Did that story come as a surprise to you?
No, because I think that story is fairly well known in the city. I mean, the version that's given in the book is the version given on the DLF website, and the actual version, of course, is much more complicated, and DLF operated through many other companies and everything. But you know, one of the reasons why a lot of these businessmen in the book are actually going to do business in Africa is because of this problem of aggregating large amounts of land in this country because of the pattern of ownership. That's how a lot of illicit fortunes were made of property aggregation. So it didn't surprise me at all. It's one of the big themes of this book. But what surprised me is that KP Singh started doing this at a time when there could be no prospect of return for years or decades. And I think that one of the amazing things about people like that is the time scales on which they operate, the amazing sense of mission they have about business. Because he started buying property in the late 70s, and it wasn't until well into the 90s that there was any prospect that Gurgaon would be able to inherit this overflow of business and residential property from Delhi. So for an incredible amount of time, he was essentially doing mad things, and looking where it got him. Other questions?
Your novel Solo won the Commonwealth Prize, while the other novel Tokyo Cancelled was listed for some other international award, which by itself was an honor. My question to you is, while awards and recognition they boost the writer's creative efforts, they also raise expectations in the mind of the readers regarding your future novel. Does the data worry you?
I mean, ultimately, each of my books has taken about 4 years to write, and it's been a very solitary process. One is not really thinking about readers in that time. It feels much more like building a house. One's just putting up some bricks and standing back and looking at it, and it's not good enough, and something's wrong, and you have to break it down and try and rebuild again. And who's actually going to come and live in it, ultimately, is not the question. It's just about architectural pleasure or architectural ambition, if that answers that question.
I found the chapter amazing, and my impression was that it's a book only a foreigner could write. You know, we who live in Delhi take so much for granted, the chaos, the poverty. People don't see the poverty. And the father came back here, and he went looking for the place where he once lived, somewhere in Karolbagh, I think.
Right.
And because of chaos, we never found that place. Did you ever go looking for it again?
No, it clearly disappeared. But I find this, it's one of the things that that I find moving about places that have changed very, very dramatically, or where you have an event like partition, where you're cut off for forever or for decades from the place that you came from. Is that when you go and look for it, that you live for decades thinking of this idea of home. That it exists there somewhere, and I'm not in it, and I'm making my life in another way, but I could theoretically go and see it. And then one day that opportunity is opened up and you go and it's not there. Or it's changed so much that you're actually horrified that you've even done this. It's shattered a lot of your ideas of yourself. And I find this it's a very moving story, and it's not really a European story so much, because a lot of Europe doesn't change very much. You can go back to the house. I can go back to the house I was born in England, but my father can't revisit any of his history here.
I actually really love the book because it explains the city that I've been fighting for the last 10 years as well, a lot more. But I want to hear more about what you're working on next.
Rana, you noticed
So would I.
that.
If anyone can tell me. I think I'm writing a children's book right now. I have a novel that I'm writing, but I'm really taking, it's another very ambitious novel. I'm trying to take a rest from ambitious things and play with things that are more charming. I'm trying to have a happier time. This is not a very happy book. Oh yeah, the first one of those. No, it's a book. I think it's aimed at sort of 8 to 12-year-olds, sort of rolled down kind of style. I've been reading a lot of A.K. Ramanujan's collected folk tales, the sort of folk tales that he collected going around India. They are sort of, they're a completely extraordinary collection. In part because he was very true to his sources. He went to listen to women telling stories, mostly women, and mostly in the south of India, but only not exclusively.
and he wrote down what they said. He didn't improve it, so sometimes the story is completely bizarre. You have no idea why this is thought to be an ending to this story. But just sometimes the story is a masterpiece, it's a kind of amazing moment in world literature. So I'm doing to one of these stories what the Grimms did to European folk tales and turning it into a children's story. It's not a children's story, it's for everyone. It's an adult story actually, but I'm making it into a children's novel, and it's a wonderful process. We're done.
I think we are done. So I think we should just give a big hand to Rana.
Thank you.